Hey everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Chad Shimabukuro with Keller Williams Honolulu. We are broadcasting on a few, or streaming rather, on a few channels at once. I think 7 or 8 channels, Facebook and YouTube. So you may be watching it on a variety of different platforms. You're welcome to watch, take notes, chat with us. Whatever platform that you might be on, you may or may not see other people on it, but we can see everyone in total. So there's a bunch of people that will jump in. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to jump in and ask. We have Carrie, who is in the background. Thank you, Carrie, for being here as always and watching the chat. He'll take a look at things from behind the scenes. And today we are going to be discussing, let me see here. See if I do this right, Carrie. I might put you on the screen by accident. We'll see here. There we go. So today we're going to be discussing strategies of a purchase contract. It's really meant for real estate agents. Certainly within Keller Williams would make most sense because it's the standards that KW operates within. But if you are an agent that's outside of Keller Williams, there's still a ton of things that you can pick up, tips, tricks, things that you can learn. I always say this to people, but you always have to invest in yourself as a real estate agent. I think in our industry, a lot of real estate there's like with anything, right? There's good agents, there's bad agents, there's agents that invest in themselves and their own growth. And we really need to understand and really master how that purchase contract works to protect our client, whether you're representing a buyer or seller. But invest in yourself. If you aim for nothing, you're going to hit it every single time. So I always try to make it a point to grow a little bit, learn a little bit more. And also, when you're dealing with and working with a purchase contract and representing a buyer, it is like a chessboard. And you can strategize and make sure that you have your client's best interests represented on that chessboard, so to speak. So one way to look at it, one way to consider that when you're going over all these things. So we're going to discuss strategies of a purchase contract. If there are any buyers or any clients of mine or anyone else that's looking, you can still pick up things as well. I'm not going to go too deep on everything. It's more kind of high level, 30,000 foot, unless of course there's specific questions, and I'll dive deeper in as you need it. So let's get started. So what's the goal? The goal is to get a better understanding of the purchase contract. Some tips and tricks in terms of negotiations and how you're strategizing that purchase contract, how to stay out of trouble. I'll give you some resources and so forth. I absolutely recommend taking notes on anything that we do. In really any industry that you're in, attorneys will take notes when a client sits in front of them. A physician will take notes when a patient sits in front of them. Real estate agents are really no different. I've said this many times before to my own agents, but I think that our industry and I think that the state does us a disservice by calling us real estate salespeople. And certainly there's salesmanship involved in what we do. There's aspects of that, but salesmanship can apply in a lot of different industries. We don't sell cars, we don't sell shoes. And in those two examples, no knock on that for anyone who does or may, but there's no fiduciary responsibility in either of those type of transactions. Whereas with real estate, there is. There is a fiduciary responsibility. There's a legal tail, meaning that there is a statute of limitations in many capacities in terms of how you handle that transaction. And so we do things a little bit differently. I think that if you are a real estate agent in any firm, whether it's with KW or anywhere else, if you keep in mind that 15% of what we do is salesmanship and 85% of what we do is really advocacy, consultation, education, telling clients and explaining to clients what the risks are involved in any decision that they might make. I take pride in being an expert at what I do, whether it's a local market or an area expert or an industry expert or what have you. But some of that comes down to just how you operate and how you deal with your clients. And taking notes is a very basic and simple thing that a lot of real estate agents don't do. So I highly recommend and make sure that you do take notes. Plus, it logs in what their goals and priorities are. And should anything go sideways, God forbid, if anything went to court or there's any kind of complaint that you have to sit in front of a panel or a board, it shows that you care, that you understand what your client's goals and priorities are. And oftentimes, what I'll do with my own clients is I'll email them back what their goals and priorities are to summarize our conversation. Per our conversation, you said that you were looking for this type of property with this price point in this area. Let me know if I've misunderstood that, kind of thing. I'm going to make this screen larger because who wants to see my face? We can see the screen. This is much better. There we go. Carrie in the background got a little bit of screen time. So when writing an offer, and again, some buyers, sellers, some clients, some people in the public may see this, which is fine. There's no hidden information or secret information here whatsoever, but it's helpful to know. If you're writing an offer and you're representing a buyer, the first thing that I recommend that you do is call the listing agent and ask some questions. I cannot tell you when I have a property that's listed, how often I just receive offers. And I'm like, did this person even see the property? I'm not even familiar with who this agent is, or I don't remember having any dialogue or conversation with them. And in real estate, like many industries, but especially real estate, especially in our local market here, connection is everything. Relationship is everything. So I highly recommend building and establishing that relationship. When you go show a property, be cordial, because you're not just selling your client on the benefits of home ownership, but you're also selling the listing agent on why they should choose you to be in transaction with. So I would recommend highly that you act professionally and do extra things as well. So when you call them, do you have any offers in hand? If so, how many? How strong are those offers? You'll get a variety of different responses. We have 3 offers in hand, or we have multiple offers, or what have you. But that just gives you an idea of what you're working with, what you might be competing with. The other question that I would ask certainly is, when are you presenting those offers to the seller? Because don't assume that it's going to be right away, or don't assume that the moment that you send that offer in, that the seller will have access to that. Besides price, what's important to the seller? I can't tell you how important this specific question is. If you choose to just only ask one question, I don't know why you would do that, but if you only could choose one question, ask that question. Besides price, what's important to the seller? The reason is because this is a negotiation. So you might have your client's best interest in mind, and the buyer has an agenda. They obviously want to get the property for a good deal and win out on other offers if there are any. The seller wants to sell the property for the highest price possible. There's 2 different agendas. There's 2 different goals. And what you want to do is remove the elephant in the room, which is the price. So besides the price, what's important to the seller? And I can't tell you how many times I've had that answer. Wow, no one's ever asked that question before. Well, what's important to the seller is, and they start naming 1, 2, 3, or 4 things. And in my mind, I'm like, wow, I cannot believe that no one's asked this question, because now I can structure the purchase contract so long as it meets my client, the buyer in this example, meets their goals and they're okay with that. We can structure it to accommodate the seller's preferences. So sometimes it's as simple as choosing the right escrow officer or escrow company. Sometimes it's a length of escrow. Sometimes it's some sort of contingency that they would like to add or to remove. But the fact that I'm asking, I'm communicating, I'm building a better relationship and a bond with the listing agent. So all those things are good things, but also then you can go back to the buyer and present a more well-crafted and curated offer, because you've already done a little bit of research. Then, of course, are there any pertinent items to disclose? And pertinent items would be things like, has it fallen out of escrow? These are things that you should have looked at, or you can see on the MLS. Is there any major issues or things that are wrong with the property that should be disclosed? Any material facts, those kind of things. And sometimes you're not going to even know what they are, if there are anything, until you actually go into escrow. That's okay. But if there's something that's glaring or a major issue, you want to ask. Don't assume that the listing agent will tell you, because many times they won't. So diving into the purchase contract, this is not intended to get boring, but sometimes if you're not in this industry, this could be. So A2 on the purchase contract, these are talking about specific portions of the purchase contract. The main thing, and I'm going to highlight it, is making sure that you don't leave blank areas. This purchase contract it has specific instructions. It says it clearly on there. If you read if you ever decide to dive in and read the purchase contract, it says do not leave anything blank. So if it's not applicable, mark not applicable. If it is applicable, mark the appropriate checkbox. A2, which is the agency portion of that, just mark it as applicable as it should be. Here's a tip with regards to earnest money deposits. This is a great way, obviously, to negotiate the contract and show the strength of the offer. What I see so many different types of ways that people structure this. It's not a right or wrong thing, but you kind of want to use a little bit of savvy, a little bit of common sense, and some negotiation ability in it. I'll give you, for instance, if you have $10,000 initial deposit, and obviously the deposit amount should be appropriate to not only what the purchase price is, but also the type of financing. So if you're looking at a property that is 400,000 or 500,000 with a VA loan, it's appropriate to have a minimum of $1,000 initial deposit. I would say in this competitive market, you probably want to increase that a little bit. But if you have $1 million or $1.5 million purchase, $1,000, even if it were a VA loan, is probably a little bit too light. If you're not competing, which is why you want to ask this series of questions that I'd mentioned before, if you're not competing, that might be fine, because you don't want to compete with yourself. They may accept that offer if there's no other offers in hand. But assuming that you are competing, assuming that we're all operating within this very competitive market that we're in, if $10,000 is what the buyer and you have discussed that they're okay with submitting as an initial deposit, why put all 10,000 down at once? And the reason I pose it that way is because if you part ways with, if anything goes sideways in that transaction, and you end up canceling, the buyer ends up canceling legitimately for a contingency that they're allowed to cancel for. In this market, in this particular state of Hawaii, is all parties have to agree on how the disbursement of that earnest money is handled. So in other words, if the buyer says I'm canceling due to the findings of the home inspection, which is very typical, and the seller says, no, I disagree, even though the buyer was operating within the appropriate time frame, then escrow does not release those funds. And so if all they have is $10,000 to work off of as their initial deposit, and they put in $10,000 because they put their best foot forward and they're moving forward as though they're purchasing it as they should, they have a reason to cancel. They attempt to cancel, and the seller says no. Now that you've inadvertently jeopardized the entire earnest money, which was unnecessary. So the point in saying that is you can structure it still getting to the $10,000 mark, but structure it and separate that out in a couple different ways. So you can put $2,500 for the initial deposit, and the remaining can be in an additional deposit. So if you look closely at the slide, and for real estate agents, you'll know what this is. But additional deposit, buy, and then it has a certain date or action in there. I would recommend after a couple of days, 2 business days specifically is what I would recommend you write. 2 business days after J1 satisfaction. J1 is the home inspection period. The reason why is because if there is going to be a cancellation of escrow, I would say 70% plus of the time, it's going to be a result of the findings of the home inspection. So, which is fine. That's the buyer's right. That's what it's for. It's due diligence. The buyer absolutely has a right to do that. But what you're doing in separating that out, 2,500, 7,500, or I would say 1,000 to 9,000 is probably not the good ratio, because you still want to show a strength of offer. You can split it up 5,000, 5,000, or whatever that earnest money is. But by splitting it up and having the remaining or the bulk of that earnest money deposit being deposited after the time frame that most cancellations occur, you're really well protecting your buyer. So that's a good strategy to have. So in C1, in the purchase contract, again, I'm speaking to Hawaii's purchase contract. In S2 of the purchase contract, which is towards the latter part of the contract of our 14-page contract, it does address that the contract is assumed to be in Hawaii Standard Time. But because Hawaii houses military, it houses a lot of retirees and people that are relocating, whether it be for job or corporate or whatever that might look like, I never want to cause inadvertently any kind of confusion. So sometimes it's just going above and beyond. What I would recommend highly is in C1, which is the expiration date of the offer. In the time frame area, I always put HST, which is Hawaii Standard Time, on purpose because, again, while the contract provides that information, I wouldn't assume that the other agent on the other side or their client is even aware of that. So I want to go above and beyond to make sure. I've addressed C2, the 2 days after J1 satisfaction. That's an example of that. I see a lot of agents kind of shortcutting it, and they'll put 2 biz days, BIZ. Uh, I don't recommend doing that. This is a legal binding contract, and if ever you got to go to court, it really reflects on your professionalism or lack thereof by abbreviating in unnecessary ways like that. You want to make sure that you act appropriately, you act as a professional, and more importantly, you're just write it out. There's room to write it out. It's not that difficult to do so. D1, which is addenda that is applicable to the purchase contract. If you read the highlight, it specifies to if it doesn't apply, write in NA if it's not applicable. Oftentimes, I'll see real estate agents put an X of things that are applicable, and everything else is left blank. Here's where you run into an issue with that is if you're dealing with someone that's unscrupulous or malicious on the other side of that transaction, be it a seller, be it another party, be it the cooperating agent, whomever that might be. If you leave it blank, you leave an opportunity for someone to fill in whatever it is that they want to fill in by pen or typing over it with in a computer typewriter, whatever that looks like. So why even put yourself in that position? Just X out that. When I say X out, I mean NA or X, depending on if it's applicable or not. To fill in the blank. It clearly states to do so. Agents tend to not read instructions, but it states that in there. So please do that. The tip on the bottom, have a strong buyer consultation. I am a huge fan, and everyone who knows me probably unknowingly can attest the fact that I keep preaching this is I think the most important conversation that you'll have with your client is either the buyer consultation or the listing presentation. And the reason why is it's your opportunity to not only show your value proposition, but it's also your opportunity to earn their business. We can't assume that they're going to do business with us. We have to earn that by way of being the market expert. And some of that, in fact, I love that because if I'm sitting down with a client and I have an opportunity to spend 45 minutes to an hour with them to educate them about what the market at the moment is, where we came from, where we're heading to, and what the proper expectation is of them finding a home that meets their goals, then I'm doing my job. I can sleep at night. I can know that I'm really invested into their best interests and not my own. A lot of agents, and some of it is lack of confidence or lack of experience, or they weren't taught any different, but a lot of agents will just run into the car and kind of start showing properties without having a sit down conversation about what this market is and what Hawaii looks like and what communities have different price points and different rules. And there's so many different things to get a better understanding of. So that buyer consultation not only sets the tone for the market at the moment, but then you can get an idea of, what are you looking for? I've had a conversation in the past with somebody that was military that relocated here. And the first thing that they said to me during the buyer consultation was, I'd like to find a place. I think they own something in like North Dakota or something like that. And they said, I want to find a home here similar to that. I want to spend no more than $250,000. I needs to have a 4 or 5 car garage, 5 or 6 bedrooms. And I'm like, that does not exist. So, as a real estate agent, as a licensee, we have an obligation to make sure that we explain those kind of things to our clients so that they don't have the expectation that you're trying to find something that doesn't exist. And then from our own selfish perspective, why would you want to, spend, 10 days showing properties that they're not going to either want or not qualify for, or so forth. Some of the things that you as an agent should know, whether you're a new agent or experienced, is some of the market statistics. You should be an expert at that. The days on market, what's the average days on market? What's the sales price to list price ratio? And I'm not, when I say these things, I'm not talking about Oahu as an island, but I'm talking about the specific areas that your client might be wanting to purchase in. So if you have a client that's looking to purchase in an area such as Ocean Point, you should know what the sales price to list price ratio is there. And the reason for that is, I have worked with clients in the past that will say, I saw a TV show on cable TV. Who has cable TV anymore? Anyways, I saw a TV show, and home was offered at 400,000, and then they offered 300,000, and by the time the commercial break came back, then they had a completely renovated home, and all in 30 minutes. And I'm like, that's not real. And we owe it to our client to ensure that they have a proper understanding of how that works. And so the sales price list price ratio for any new agents or consumers out there who are listening that don't know what that is, I'll give you an example. So if the average price is, I'm using very round numbers here, but if the average price is $100,000 for the list price, and the average closing in that neighborhood or area or whatever that statistic that you're looking at is 105. That means it's 105% sales price to list price ratio, which means that homes in that particular market are selling for 5% above asking price. Likewise, if the average price was 100,000 and its average closing is 97,000, then it's on 97%, which is 3% under asking price. The reason why that's important for both a seller and a buyer to know is when you're talking to a seller before even listing their property, the conversation you might be having is one where, hey, the market is softening a little bit, or on average, listings are not getting what they're asking for. There's a little bit of room for negotiation, so that you can properly have that conversation about what that right expectation is. Likewise, in this crazy seller's market that we're in right now, what it does is it tells the buyer, if someone is trying to, by the way, that $100,000 example is a funny one because I don't think you can get a parking stall here in this market for 100,000. But let's say that the price is 700,000, and if in the area you're looking at it's a 105% sales price to list price ratio, the conversation that you should be having with the buyer is, it's very likely that you might have to pay above what the asking price is in this specific community if you hope to have the winning bid on this property. Is that okay with you? What does that look like? Would you be upset if you weren't able to get that property for that price? And by the way, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that everyone needs to overpay just because the sales price to list price ratio states that. But that's a statistic that you need to know, and that's a statistic that you should educate your clients on as well, and have conversations around that. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so E2. E2 is inclusion. Oh, by the way, I skipped over this yesterday. And Carrie, maybe if you don't mind making a note so I can update my slides as well. But E1 is the description of the property, the legal description. Other firms do this as well, and they don't find anything wrong with it. I personally don't like that. I think it's a liability issue. But on E1, there is a description, and sometimes people will put on there, for instance, fee simple interest in a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom home that is, and they put the square footage. They'll put in there 1,400 square feet on a lot size that's X amount of square feet. We don't do that. Or if it's a condo or townhome, they'll put stall number 23 and stall number 24. The reason why I don't recommend doing that, and again, if you are watching and you're with a different firm, check with your BIC, check with your broker, check with your principal broker. I'm speaking kind of a general advice, and certainly absolutely a standard for KW agents. But the reason why is because you're creating a potential liability. So what if, for instance, you put on there 1,400 square foot because however you got that information, maybe it's from public record, which is where you're pulling it from. But at the end of the day, the appraiser went out there and took a different square footage that happens to be a little bit less. You could obviously defer back to the sources of that information, but I wouldn't even get into that. So what I rely on is just the address and the simple description of it, leaving out square footage, leaving out things like zoning. I've even seen people put the actual tax dollar amount on there, and that information, I would not put that information in there. That's not applicable. It shouldn't go there anyways. And with regards to condos and townhomes, when you put a stall number, just know that in many cases, I would say a vast majority, the stall is not deeded with the property when it conveys. So what that means is it's a common area that the HOA can, if they wanted to, and they don't typically do it, but you don't want to rely on that. You want to be safe. But they can reassign stalls. Or if someone has a if some clients have a weird thing about numbers, what if they didn't physically move the stall around, but they reassigned the number? So they went from stall 10 to stall 13, and that client has a superstition around that number. You're just getting yourself into a whole thing, and I just wouldn't put it in there. So I would keep it simple. Okay, so moving back to E2. E2 is the inclusion area of the purchase contract. Inclusions are things like the items that are supposed to convey with the property, dishwasher, air conditioning, and so forth. Same thing applies, as I mentioned before. If it's not applicable, put NA. There's a section, as you guys can see on the screen, in section E2 where it says other, and there's 4 different things in there you can put in there. One of the things kind of by standard that I would always recommend is if attached, as attached. That's just as a common sense that if it's a fixture, sometimes if you don't put certain things in there, people could remove things. One thing that I see most often is the TV mounts. Like when people mount a TV on a wall, you have to decide how you want that either removed or left on there. What I typically would advise a buyer, and again, we have the duty of instruction, so we want to make sure that we're consulting with our client as well and finding out what their goals are and their desires are. But what you don't want is just to assume like, oh, just go ahead and take it down and remove it. Because what if they leave a hole, and then you're like, hey, you left this hole here, and they're going to come back and say, well, you asked us to remove it. So be real cautious, and you have to almost make everything that you're doing as though you're speaking to a child. Not to suggest that your counterpart or the cooperating agent is a child, but you got to be real clear and real specific as to what your goals are, your intentions are, and what your hopeful outcome is in that transaction, and the instructions that you're giving to either side. E3. This is the photovoltaic or PV system. A lot of people think that this is just for leased systems because it says leased systems on it, but it also says other. I would recommend that you use this section, whether it's leased or owned. And the reason why, there's so many different types of contracts for PV. Some of it have maintenance agreements, some of it has a buyout at the end. There's all kinds of different things. So what you want to make sure of is, even though it's not a lease, it might be owned or something to that effect, you want to make sure that the seller provides any and all information they have on this particular system so that your clients have the opportunity to review it. Because what if there's something in there that they don't like? What if the seller said, yo, this is a brand new system, I just bought it 2 years ago, and it has a shelf life of 20 years or whatever it is, and you think that it's fully owned, but there is an annual fee that's involved for the maintenance, and if you don't do it, it voids the warranty. That's an exact situation that I've seen before, and one that the buyer would be very unhappy with if you didn't provide them the information so they can review it, accept it, or cancel altogether. And you want to make sure that you provide them the right to do so. And eliminating this area altogether would remove their ability to cancel. E4, and this is rare, but it comes up every now and again. Inclusion of furnishings. A couple things on this is, you want to make sure that if any furnishings are going to be conveyed with the property, check with the lender. Is there financing involved? If there is, you got to make sure you handle this the right way, because as soon as the lender sees this, they may assume, just because lenders tend to do that, is assume that there might be some value that might convey with it. So they may require some documentation or additional addenda that specifies that the furnishings are transferred or purchased outside of closing, or at no value, or whatever that is. Another little tip is, if you do have furniture, and it could be for a vacation rental, or it could be a condotel, that's very typical that furniture does convey. Take photos of it. Be as detailed as possible. I cannot tell you, I hate to say this, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen a seller or a listing agent switch furniture around because they're like, they don't care. We're going to take the nice dining room table and leave them the junky one, or we're going to take the fine art and the painting or what have you that they thought they were going to get, and we're going to switch it out with something else. Don't do that. Make sure that you protect your client, the buyer in this case. That's the perspective we're looking at it through. Take photos, document it. If it's appliances, I even go so far as to take a photo of the serial number. So E4 is the furnishings. F2 is the closing. So what you'll see here is oftentimes people will do one of two things, in my experience, is they'll put on there within 30 days or within 45 days of acceptance. That's pretty typical. Or they'll put out a hard date. One thing I would just caution you, the hard date, like when I say a hard date, I mean like, October 25th, 2021. It's not that you shouldn't do that, but be very cautious, because what if you're dealing with a seller that's on the mainland, or someone that's relocated, or whatever the case is? If that's the case, in that negotiation process, assuming that you sent the offer out, they've taken 2, maybe 3 days to review that offer, they've generated a counter, they've sent it back to you, you're reviewing that counter, you've already burned through, 3 at minimum, maybe even 5 or 6 days of your hard date. So the date may not have changed. It's still October 25th if you weren't if neither party changed it in the counter. But be very cautious when you're using hard dates. There's got to be a specific reason. Maybe it's a tax issue. Maybe if it's a move out issue. Maybe it's an arrival issue, in terms of if your client is military coming in or going out, or whatever the case is. What I always recommend doing as a safety net is put days, because within 30 days or within 45 days of acceptance is a much easier target to work within. That's talking about, it's a moving target based upon when all parties agree and fully execute the contract. So that's a far safer way to go. The other thing that we highly recommend doing is adding the term on here, and delivered vacant, or to be delivered vacant. So where you see F2, 30 days from acceptance and delivered vacant. And the reason is, especially in these times now, and it's not really been fully tested yet, but with the moratorium on evictions, a lot of properties that were investment properties or tenant occupied properties had a holdover on tenants, and a lot of them, could care less about this contract. In their minds, it didn't impact or affect them at all. So some of them didn't move out or vacate altogether. And while the contract does address this in another section, which we'll get to, it's advisable. We spoke to our attorney about as well. It's advisable just to reiterate this, because it reiterates the intention and the goal of the buyer. So within 30 days from acceptance and to be delivered vacant. But one of the things that before you put any kind of date in there, again, making sure you take off your salesman hat, put on your fiduciary hat, your consultant hat, your licensed realtor hat. Check with the buyer's lender to ensure that they can even close within that time frame. If you're doing a USDA loan, or you're doing a VA loan, make sure that the lender you're working with, not to say for VA, there's some really great lenders out there that can close within 30 days. That's not an issue. So I'm not suggesting that VA can't close in that time frame, or even less. There's some that I have personally seen close less, but don't assume that. Check, because some lenders get bogged down. I know that when the rates were at its lowest, all lenders were completely jammed up with refinances, and the appraisals were taking a long time. So even if it's a lender that you used a ton of times before, and you're like, yeah, they've closed so quickly, just do yourself a favor, do your client a favor, and just confirm with a loan officer, hey, are you guys running on time? Are you guys running behind? Are you able to close in 30 days? And build that in appropriately. So that's number one. Number two is the extension period, F3. F3, in the previous form of this contract, this contract was updated in May of 2019. In 2019, you had to have bilateral agreement, which means both sides had to agree to extend, and it's changed. It's changed to a unilateral. Unilateral means just one party. Typically, it's the buyer, but either the buyer or the seller can use F3 and extend. Here's a tricky thing. I just ran into this recently with one of my agents and a loan officer. So we, meaning Keller Williams, we represented the buyer on a transaction, and it was like a 30-day close, and it had 15 days in there for F3A, which is the right to extend. And we sent the contract, obviously, to the lender as they're processing and underwriting and what have you. But just a couple of days before signing and a few days before closing, our agent, the KW agent, reached out to the loan officer just to make sure they're still in the right time frame, and nothing is going to be extended, and confirming that the client's going to be signing and so forth. And they responded back with, oh no, we have we have 15 more days, so we don't need to close on that date. And that to me, those of you who don't know, I'm also a mortgage banker too. And whether you're in mortgage or in real estate, those two industries certainly require unbelievable communication ability. Time is everything, and sense of urgency is everything, because we're dealing with contracts that other parties are tied to. And if you don't honor those contracts, you can jeopardize someone's money. There could be financial damages involved. And what that loan officer's response is, yeah, we have 15 days, we can use it. And it's not a big deal. It's part of the contract. So really it's not 30-day closing, it's a 45-day closing. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. And that's not true at all, because if it was a 45-day closing, it would say within 45 days of acceptance. Here's the risk that they run. Could we have extended it for 15 days? Sure. When all the stars align and there's no other issues, yes, the answer is we could extend that for 15 days. But because it's a one-time unilateral right to extend, either party could extend. And so before we reach out to the other side and say, hey, we're going to use that 15 days, the other side could have said, oh, we're going to use 2 days. And by the mere fact that they used F3A in that way, they've burned the entire ability for us to have used it. So it goes away. So in law, and certainly in contracts, and certainly in real estate, don't assume anything. That's just a bad idea. So again, check with a loan officer. Sadly, in this case, the agent did check with a loan officer prior to when they confirmed that 30 days was not an issue. But the loan officer changed their time frame. So it's a good idea to continually check back with vendors to make sure that things close. That is F3. F4 is if you're not competing with another offer. One of our partner companies, First White Title, is a fantastic choice to use. F8 is on the buy side. So if you're writing a contract for an offer, you're going to want to select, this is, by the way, assessment, sorry. You're going to want to select seller on both F8A and B and write none in each of the blanks. But if you're on the list side and there's an assessment, by the way, these are some of the questions that you definitely want to know. And this is obviously pertaining primarily to condos and townhomes, not single family homes, but you're going to want to make sure that you ask all the right questions if you're on the buy side as to any assessments. One of the things that I would get in the habit of doing too is if it's a condo or townhome, I would look at other listings to see if an assessment shows up on those listings. And again, not that you're taking MLS information from one and kind of comparing it to another, but you really want to just see if there's 10 listings in the building and 9 of them show an assessment, but yet this one doesn't. You want to ask the right questions. It doesn't mean that there is an assessment. It could have been one that's paid off, but you want to ask the proper questions to ensure there's no surprises while in escrow. And if you're on the list side and there's an assessment, make sure that you have the seller disclose that. One of the things that I always took pride in is to ensure that when I took a listing, the Srpds was done, condo docs were available, that's association documents were all available, survey, if applicable, was available. Those things, you as real estate agents have to get ahead of these kind of things. I mean, the fact that some listing agents find out about a major problem on a disclosure or with the property while it's in escrow means that they didn't look into it ahead of time. And maybe they weren't taught the right way, but you absolutely have to get ahead of these kind of things. And it makes for such a smooth transaction, and the other cooperating agent will appreciate it when there's no need for extensions and all these other kind of things because you've handled these things ahead of time. So again, if you're on the list side and you know that the seller has an assessment, make sure that you note it here and how, or counter if you're countering this a purchase contract that you're receiving. Make sure that it's noted on the Srpds. Hopefully that Srpds is already provided to the buy side. I would even suggest putting it in the MLS supplement section. On the buy side, though, you want to make sure that how is that going to be handled? Is it going to be prorated? Is it going to be taken care of entirely by the seller? If you are aware of these, I would not only mark it in here in the F8 section, but I would also put it in section Q on how you intend on handling it too. Moving on to F12, keys of the property. Per this new contract, the new iteration of the contract, is only one set of keys are provided. So if you need more keys, I would highly recommend putting that information into E2. E2 is the inclusions. So you can put garage, openers. You can put fobs if applicable. If you're in a condo that has fobs to access the pool area or workout area or whatever it is, you can put whatever it is that you want to put on there. You can put that into the inclusion section or in section Q. H1. H1 is on the buy side, make sure that you're entering the type of proof of funds. And so here's the long and short of it. If you have the purchase contract in front of you, if you refer to it later, if you're just kind of listening to this, H1, it says on there, bank statement, verification from depository financial institution or other. So you can check, basically any three of those things or what have you. I oftentimes see real estate agents select bank statement. I see that all the time. I don't recommend doing that. There's a variety of reasons why. One is if you should not be sending things unredacted to another side, because then you open up the possibility of a malicious individual having your client's personal information. The other thing too is I don't want my client's personal information, to be honest with you. I leave that to the lender. Lenders have to operate by a certain set of standards to protect the data of clients. In real estate, we're not held to that same high level of standards. I would rather not even touch that if I don't have to. I'd rather the lender do that. Verification from depository financial institution, similar thing. That's easier. That's just usually a letter from the bank that says how much money you have in the bank. But here's the other reason why for bank statement and for the verification of depository financial institution is they will give you the exact amount that the client has. And so when we're talking about negotiation, this is strategies of a PC. It's part of negotiation. Let's say that your client is offering on a property and maybe that property is overpriced, which is not uncommon in this market, but let's say it's overpriced. It's overpriced by $30,000 and you're kind of negotiating back and forth with an appraisal clause, an escalation clause, and all these other kind of things. If you submit a bank statement and that bank statement has, $300,000 that's in it, you might not have helped your client with regards to protecting their ability to negotiate because you've shown kind of all your cards. So when it comes down to further negotiation, if there is any or whatever the case is, and the seller knows how much money that the buyer has, that could, not always will, but it could impact the negotiation. Same thing with verification. While it's not as detailed with all the transactions, it has the total amount. What I would recommend, I certainly recommend to all my agents, but what you should prefer, what would be helpful to the buyer is just put on their proof of funds from buyer's lender. This is again assuming that the buyer has a lender. So if they're paying cash, it's a different thing altogether. But not very many transactions are all cash. So proof of funds from buyer's lender means that the lender is just saying we reviewed the buyer's assets and their portfolio and all their documentation, and we can state with certainty that they have enough funds to close. There's no dollar amount that's being stated. And there's no providing of confidential or private documents. So that's by far and away, that's the best way to go. That's again, if you're on the buy side. So I say this kind of often, attorneys, real estate agents will oftentimes give contrary advice depending on who we're representing, if we're representing a buyer or seller. So that's my advice if we're representing a buyer. If on the list side though, so we're representing the seller and someone sends you over a purchase contract and it has proof of funds from buyer's lender, you can accept that. That's not detrimental. It's not a huge deal. But oftentimes I would counter back and say, no, I want the bank statement because yes, I am trying to see their hand if I'm playing poker, using a poker analogy. So it depends on who we're representing and what's best suited. And it is a negotiation. So you give some, you take some. So it kind of depends on what's important. But in certain circumstances, not a big deal. In other circumstances, huge deal. So just know your client's goals and priorities and understand the whole situation so that you can properly handle these kind of negotiations. In some cases, you might use H1 and H2. H2 is the contingency on obtaining cash funds. It depends on where the funds are coming from. You can break it down in either one or the other. In some rare circumstances, it could be both. Moving to seller disclosure. So I1B, and I was gonna make this larger, but you really can't make it larger. Sorry about that. So seller disclosure. This is the Srpds. The Srpds, the seller disclosure, is not it's required by law. There's a statute, 508D, that requires sellers to disclose any material facts that they're aware of the property. Oftentimes, I'll see real estate agents use 10 days or around that amount of time, 7 days, 10 days, for I1. Here's why that's not a good idea, in my opinion. I want to make that as short as possible. A good listing agent will already have that thing ready anyway, so it's moot. And you open up escrow. Here's the Srpds. Great, that's a great agent to work with. But I would put on there 1 or even 2 days, no more than 3 days. The reason is because if you're going to be doing a home inspection, usually you're going to do a home inspection within the first 7 to 10 days of opening up escrow. Ideally, what you're going to want to have as an agent, and if any consumers or clients or buyers are seeing this as well, this is a helpful hint on how you can talk to or speak with your agent about some of your goals. Ideally, you're going to want to have the seller's disclosure in your hand um, within a couple of days so that you can thoroughly review it. You can ask questions of the seller. You can say, hey, I noticed that you installed a brand new AC unit. Do you have the receipts for that? Or if it's a split system, was that installed by a licensed professional? Is there a warranty that comes with that that's transferable? All those questions are super important because when you have that, or I gave you information on installation, but what if it was repairs? What if there was a leak that every year when it rains super hard around a certain time of year, there's in the corner of the roof, it leaks. But don't worry, it's not a big deal. We've already had it fixed. That's kind of, some people's position on it. But what you want to have is you want to have that information so you can provide that Srpds to the home inspector, so the home inspector can pay special attention to problem areas. And that's you doing your job and really looking out for the buyer. So don't make that longer. I've literally seen a home inspection period of 7 days, and I've seen the seller disclosure of 10. That means that you're going to get the seller disclosure in the worst case scenarios of each. You're going to get the seller disclosure after you do the home inspection. There are some instances where I've represented a buyer where after we reviewed the seller disclosure, the buyer canceled, which they have the right to cancel, obviously, for the seller disclosure, but they canceled after they've read through that seller disclosure. I want that right away because if they had the home inspection, then they would have paid for the home inspection for no reason at all if they were to cancel just solely based on that Srpds. So make sure that you make that as short as possible. On the list side, it's recommended that you have it completed prior to. I've kind of alluded to that. On I2, I2 is the amended disclosure. So same exact thought process on I2. An amended disclosure, by the way, for consumers or for newer agents that might be listening, is the initial disclosure. Here you go. I'll open up escrow hopefully within a day or two. Here's a seller's disclosure of anything and everything that they know about the property, good, bad, and indifferent. Upgrades and repairs and replacements and so on and so forth. It's a 5-page document that allows a lot of data and information. By the way, I'm told that that document is also growing in length and it's going to be longer in pages as well. With that said, on the list side, or on the amended side rather, if there is something that happens during the course of escrow, and that document needs to be amended, it could be amended for a variety of different things. I mean, maybe there's a leak that's discovered after escrow is opened. Maybe during the buyer's home inspection, you as a listing agent, maybe you learn that there's something wrong with the property after hearing what the home inspector is telling the buyer. There's a variety of reasons why you want to amend that disclosure statement. Some people, some agents that I've spoken with are of the mindset that I don't want to amend it because it gives the buyer the right to cancel. Yeah, it does give the buyer the right to cancel. They have the right to do that. But it's really, really important because it protects all parties, because one of the major reasons for a lawsuit after closing in real estate is for non-disclosure. So you want to make sure that on the buy side that is as short as possible, because if you have that as 10 days and you intend on closing in 5 days, that's you just blew it for the buyer. The buyer wouldn't have known. And again, using the full 10 days, they wouldn't have even known what that issue was, and they would have closed and not have the right to have canceled. So you want to know right away. On the list side, again, I'm going to give contrary advice. On the list side, you want to make that as long as possible. And that's not for any malicious reason whatsoever, but I'll give you a reason why. Because I've had this exact thing happen to me. Is on the list side, we might be listing a property for sale, being in escrow, and while in escrow, the AC stopped working. Well, immediately we took action. We had it repaired and then redisclose it with the amended Srpds. But in that scenario, we got ahead of the problem before a problem even what was made an issue. So before the buyer could go, oh my gosh, I want to cancel, we can say, yes, you absolutely have the right to cancel. Here's the amended Srpds. But just so you know, we've already had it fixed. Here's a receipt. It was through a licensed person, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the reasons why on the list side you want a little bit more time, whereas on the buy side you would want it a little less. H3A pertains to the receipt of the Srpds. Some people get kind of caught up on this and they want that as long as possible. That's not signing off on it. It's just acknowledging that you've received it. Really not that big a deal. I3B pertains to the time to examine it. I3C pertains to the time to examine the amended Srpds, both of which are really, really important. And I see this 3 days, 5 days. That's not long enough. I'll be honest with you, especially an amended one. An amended one means that something happened or it's something that the seller wasn't aware of. It was either discovered during the home inspection period or it's something that happened that changed while in escrow. And so let's say that it is a roof kind of thing or it's an AC thing, something that requires a licensed professional to go back out and take a look at it. If you have it as 3 days or 5 days, how often, especially in Hawaii, have you called a roofer or a licensed contractor or anything and they go, sure, I'm not doing anything at all. I was just sitting around hoping that you'd call me. I'm headed over right now. That never happens. They're usually like, I'm booked out 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So you want to make it as long as possible so you have the opportunity to try to have a remedy or solution for your client. A tip, write I3C with 15 days for the benefit of the buyer. So that's on that other section there. I3 is seller driven primarily, and I4 is buyer driven. As it states on there, you can read the contract yourself. Lead-based paint. I think a lot of people, this is what I've seen recently, and I don't know if it's new agents or just people kind of rushing through because of the market and how hot and how crazy it is. But you can't avoid this. This is a federal requirement. So the EPA requires that any property that's built 1978 or earlier have a lead-based paint disclosure attached to it. It is something to be taken seriously. I highly recommend that you follow all the steps involved in that document. I usually go the extra step too and provide them a copy of the EPA handout, which you can Google. And it's, I don't know how many pages it is, but it's a long one, but it's, PDF. But if there is a property that is 1978 or earlier, I typically will put that in with the purchase contract and have my client sign and initial that document as well to ensure that they know and it's documented that I provided that information to them for a property that fits within this criteria. J3 is the final walkthrough. J8 is the removal of items. J9 is cleaning. Here's the thing that a lot of agents do. This to me seems like a no-brainer, but I see this happen often is there's certain things that kind of happen chronologically. And so I understand that agents go, no later than 5 days prior to closing or whatever. I get all of that. But what happens in a transaction typically is you put these dates in there and you hand it off to a transaction coordinator or a transaction manager, and they're not thinking logically. Some of them are not licensed, so they're not allowed to think in terms of a real estate transaction. They're just literally doing data entry. So they're taking the data from the purchase contract and putting it into a timeline and then kind of helping move your transaction along. The problem with that is there's no thought behind it either. So no one's going, oh, wait a minute. If my final walkthrough needs to be 5 days prior to closing, and I have cleaning 5 days prior to closing, and I have removal of items 5 days prior to closing, that's the same day. That's literally the same day. And when it's done like that, more often than not, you go to schedule your final walkthrough and someone goes, you know what, we can't do it because the carpets are still wet or they're still moving things out. So I would highly recommend doing yourself a favor and at least chronologically addressing that issue, which I've stated here. J8, removal of items 7 days, cleaning in 6 days. So now the items are gone. Now you can clean it. And then 5 days, now you can have your final walkthrough. So at least it's chronological. So there's an order of things. Could the other side still screw any of those dates up? Sure. But at least you've done your job to try to minimize that as much as possible. In section J4 of the contract is withholdings. And there's a little box on there that if any work should be completed, you can choose to have it within the time frame of closing or X amount of days after closing. Never, if at all possible, unless you talk and speak with your broker first, your principal broker, your BIC. Try to avoid that, because once escrows close, it's really, really hard to keep people motivated to do anything at all. There's so much craziness that happens and occurs. You want to leverage that time within escrow to do that. For our company, for our firm, and you want to check with yours, but I think it's a good idea, is J3. You want to have a minimum of 5 days, because there's 3-day weekends. There's a lot of things that are going on. And so what the purpose of J3 is to ensure that there's no new damage, new issues that have arose, not same issues, new issues that may have arisen from the last time that you inspected the property. The last time you inspected the property was J1, which is a home inspection. So perfect example that I had in one of my transactions was everything was fine with the property. We did J1, we did the home inspection, it was great. Went to do final walkthrough and had noticed that the refrigerator stopped working and the ice had melted that was in the ice maker onto the hardwood floors, which damaged and warped the hardwood floors. The home was, I don't know, 20 something years old, and that style of flooring was discontinued, which meant that even though the damage was relegated to about 12 inches, the entire floor had to be replaced. So it was to the tune of like $28,000 or something like that. That's a major issue, right? That's a huge problem. Fortunately, that was covered under the seller's home insurance, but we had enough time to act. So we had enough time to call them and to get an assessment and to file the claim and all these other kind of things. If you have it, I've literally seen people do the J3, which is the final walkthrough, 1 day before closing, 2 days, 3 days. Don't do that to yourself. That's causing so much potential headache, especially when you're on the buy side. Now, this is contrary advice time. If you're on the list side, you could care less. So if you're on the listing and they come to you and say that there's a 1 day J1, okay. The J1 benefits the buyer. It doesn't benefit the seller. So again, we want to cooperate well. That's why I'm doing this, so that I can tell all agents how this works, so they should know. But it is not your job to protect the buyer when you represent the seller, and vice versa. So agents, invest in yourself, learn the contract, treat it with respect, and treat it like a chessboard, and hopefully you can better maneuver and negotiate. J8, there's a little, or J9, there's a little box, entire property professionally cleaned. I would highly recommend on the buy side, explaining to the client, what is your intention? Do you want the gutters cleaned? Do you want those kind of things? If you want that, address that in section Q. I don't ever want to mislead or trick anyone into thinking the entire property should be cleaned. The problem is that entire property professionally clean, legally, the entire property means the entire property inside and out. If you're on the list side and you have an offer that comes in, that box is checked for entire property, I would absolutely delete that and strike that and remove that and say interior property, if in fact that's what your intention is. But more importantly than that, what I would recommend, to be quite honest with you, which we typically try to do as much as possible, is whether you're on the buy side or list side, just negotiate a credit in lieu of cleaning. Again, there's circumstances why a buyer would want to have it cleaned instead of dealing with it on their own. But for all intents and purposes, especially with people's, it's so subjective whether something's been cleaned to someone's standards or not. I've had professional companies come in and do a cleaning, and the buyer goes in and does like a white glove inspection, and for the most part, everything's pretty clean. But if the cleaning was done, too far out, and it's in an area that has jealousies and dust and wind are coming in, and the buyer kind of does a white glove inspection and notices there's some dust on their finger, I've had people be super irate because they're not confident and satisfied with the cleaning. So one thing that makes it much easier is just to negotiate that out. K1, it's not really used on Oahu. That's staking only. K2 is used. That's survey. Is not necessary, obviously, for condo or townhomes. Depends on if it's some CPRs, yes, many no. Certainly for single family residences. And oftentimes what you see, let me back this up. Oftentimes what you see in our market now is, because the market's so hot, people will accept an existing survey. And there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. So I see this happen all the time is you'll ask for a survey and they'll counter back, and the countering language, which is good for the seller. Again, contrary advice, the seller says something to the effect of buyer shall accept existing survey. That's it. That's all they say. Okay, if they sign that, that's fine if you represent the seller, but if you represent the buyer, that is not a good idea. And here's why. Well, when are you going to get the survey? Are you going to have an opportunity to review it? Do you have an opportunity to cancel based on its findings? Has there anything been done to the property boundary wise or wall or fence wise since that survey was conducted? And the answer to that is probably I don't know, because it's not clear enough. So for KW agents, I've written language in a clause so that you can use it in the proper way, but it should look, for anyone else that's outside of KW, it should read something to the effect of uh, in section Q or the counter or however it is seller shall provide within 3 days of acceptance the full survey from whatever company or whatever surveyor, dated whatever date that is, um, and buyer shall have 7 days to review and terminate using O2 of the purchase contract. O2 because you want to make sure that they are allowed to cancel, and if they do cancel, they're doing so and getting their earnest money back. That's what you're trying to protect. And then what you want to do on top of that is you want to have the seller put on the Srpds, which again is required by law. That's basically an affidavit, and it carries with it a statute of limitations, and it's a whole thing, which is really a protectionary device for the buyer. So you want to have the seller update the Srpds and validate and verify that since the date of this survey, that there's been no modification, erosion, deterioration, or erection of any kind of new walls, uh, fences, trees, or anything like that at all that would be on the property line. And the purpose of doing that is you're now making it and putting it in writing. So that's the way to properly do that, to protect the buyer. Again, great if you're on the sell side, that one little small vague sentence, but not if you're on the buy side. Just so you know, buyer does not have the right to cancel as a result of dissatisfaction during the final walkthrough. That happens. I can't tell you how many times that happens where people go, yeah, if you don't like the property by the final walkthrough, you can cancel. You cannot cancel. It depends on the circumstance of what it is. But if it's like cleaning, for instance, I've seen people try to cancel due to cleaning. And what that tells me is they're not canceling because of the clean. They're canceling because of something else. It's just the cleaning was a last straw. And client management, good buyer consultation, good communication with your client should have resolved or remedied any kind of angst or issues that may have been present throughout that transaction. So that's on you, buyer's agent, if in fact they try to cancel because of the cleaning. So can you cancel for anything else during J1? The answer is yes and no. You can't just on its face, but it opens up other issues. So if you're canceling because there's another issue that came up while you were at the J3, so J4 is that remedy. That remedy is to withhold for repairs. So if they've agreed to do a certain number of repairs during the home inspection period, or something else comes up that was new, J4 allows for a withholding, so that can be remedied. However, if it's material, which it probably will be if you're doing a withholding, then I2 kicks in. I2 is the amended disclosure, which now does allow the buyer to cancel. So that's why I say yes and no. It depends on what the circumstances are, but you don't want it. Hopefully, it's not going to be something that gets that far along. Communication is key. Make sure that you're communicating with your client. I'll skip this one. Another thing, L2 is termite inspection. That's pretty simple. You can write who the termite inspector is in section Q. I typically do, just because that's one less thing to worry about. You're informing the other side. M1 is association documents, and it has a whole huge section. If you notice on section M1, so the page that you're looking at, yes, I know it's a little small on your screen, but if you look, the only thing on there that you can check whether X or NA is L2, which is a termite. You always want to do a termite inspection for the most part too, but that's the only paragraph in the purchase contract that has something that you can check or NA. If you notice, M1 does not have that, and it clearly states in the purchase contract the authors did not intend for that to be NA'd or striked out. And I see this often where in section Q, or someone will counter delete M1. Why, I don't know why you would delete it. It's not meant to be deleted at all because there's more things that are tied to M1 than just association documents. So just leave it alone. It doesn't hinder anyone. M2, this is how those documents, if there are documents, how they're going to be delivered. I always recommend putting electronically formatted documents via email and the internet address where the documents are located. Only those two. The other ones are uh, printed copies in a CD or DVD. The issue with that is if you cancel or terminate escrow, then you got to return those things. HARPTA is a big deal. So HARPTA and FERPTA are very, very expensive withholdings. If you are working with a client who is trying to figure out whether they want to sell or rent out the property, what I would always recommend doing is creating a net sheet. You can do so within zip forms. You can do so within your CRM system, whatever you might be using, or preferably you can call your preferred title or escrow officer and have them put one together for you. And the purpose of the net sheet is to show the homeowner or the potential seller what the potential tax consequences are if they convert that property from an owner-occupied property to an investment property. So you're giving them a snapshot into the future. If you sold now, this is what your proceeds would look like being an owner-occupied property, as well as having a homeowner exemption, whether they're single or married. That you would just put those numbers in there. However, if you intend on selling that property, and 3 years from now, whatever that looks like, here's where HARPTA would kick in, assuming that HARPTA figures are still the same. And they're typically pretty shocked to see what that withholding even looks like. So HARPTA withholding is off of the sale amount and not on the proceeds, like capital gains is. So it's a trickier thing. It comes out of escrow automatically, as many real estate agents know. But that's a good tip to have as in terms of a discussion with a potential seller. Show them what HARPTA would look like and how it applies to them. Section Q, special terms. The things that you're most commonly used here is TRR selection, which, as I mentioned that before, I typically will put in there Q1. Buyer selects ABC Termite Company to satisfy L2. And the reason why you would do that is that's one less thing that you or your transaction coordinator has to do, because you've now informed them of who the buyer is going to be using for TIR. Building permit package. If you're even requesting one, in some cases you may want to, especially if the seller says, "Oh no, these are permitted," but yet you pull it up on public record, it doesn't appear to be permitted. You might want to ask for a building permit package, or if you think something is a little wonky with what they've done with the property, you can request that. And that would go here in section Q. Escalation clauses, appraisal clauses, all kinds of clauses. If you're with KW, we have written all of them for you so that you don't have to do that and don't do that on your own. Just go to zip forms and go to global clauses. If you're not with KW, call and ask your broker, because they're probably going to have approved language that they're okay with. But real estate agents shouldn't be doing that entirely on their own. This is internal. It's our own internal policy, but I will say this because a lot of agents don't understand this, but the broker signature reviewed by, that little box on the very bottom, you're looking at page 14 of the purchase contract, or page 2 of the counter. That's reserved for rejections only, because it follows the spirit of the law. That is not a new law. In fact, here's the law. It's HAR 16993J, and it basically states that this law is not, as I mentioned, it's not a new thing. I'm licensed in 18 states, and so it's in most places that I'm licensed in. I don't know if it's in all 50 states, but back in the day. By the way, Carrie, do you know that I've been doing this so long now, I can actually say back. I'm now authorized to say back in the day. Back in the day, when you would reject, or seller would reject an offer, you would write on the face of the purchase contract "rejected," and you would send it back. You would fax it back to the other side. And it wasn't insulting. That was just how you would formalize and make known that it's being rejected. Well, we got away from that for whatever reason. I think in most markets, they got away from that entirely. The law didn't change. It was still required, but people maybe got lazy, or the market was moving so quickly. And so fast forward, what ended up happening was a lot of buyers agents were going, "Hey, did the seller even see my offer? Was it even submitted? Was it even reviewed?" So trying to maintain cooperation and being objective, the group of agents that are on the forms committee, they added that box in there to satisfy this. The law that was already in place, it's not new, but if something's being rejected, the seller can sign that or the broker can sign that to basically tell the other side, yes, your offer was submitted. The seller has seen it and reviewed it and opted to reject it. What I see most recently is people are using that as where their broker signature should go, just for sake of signing it if you're accepting an offer. So here's what I would say to that. So our own agents in KW don't do that. We're not signing that area unless it's rejected. For agents that are outside of KW, you can do whatever you want. It's your own firm's policy. But just like I cannot put a guideline or a standard on your firm, the vice versa would work as well. So do whatever your broker or principal broker asks, but it does not need to be signed to be considered fully executed. And the reason for that is simple: is the broker is not party to that contract being considered fully executed. The principals are. The principals are the buyer and seller. And I've even heard some agents have called, and they've been proven wrong many times, but they've called and said, "I'm not going to submit this. I'm not going to open up escrow unless your broker signs this." That's actually unethical. You could lose your license for that. So if you're an agent outside of KW, don't do that. We don't want you to lose your license. That would be a shame. We like working with you. Why would you do that? How to stay out of trouble. So here's some things. I'm going to blow past this as quickly as possible, but it's imperative to, when you're working, if anyone's working for you, an assistant, make sure that they have their real estate license, an active real estate license. If they're doing real estate activities, that's the kicker, is if they're making calls for you and having real estate conversations, that's real estate activities. They got to be licensed. Don't have someone unlicensed practicing real estate. That's going to get you in trouble. In fact, that's aiding and abetting, and it comes with a financial penalty. You can have an ethics complaint. You can have a RICO complaint. Your license is too valuable. Don't do it. It's not worth it. Can an unlicensed assistant host an open house? Yes and no. They can host it. They can't have any real estate conversations, which means that the moment someone goes, hey, is this a good area to purchase? Or what is the purchase price again? And how long has it been on the market? All those kind of things are real estate conversations. So no sense in having someone who can't even answer a simple question host an open house. They can be there with you, and they can assist you in having people sign in and hand out flyers, but all real estate conversations should be directed to the licensee. Can an unlicensed assistant answer an incoming call for you? Absolutely. They sure can. That's a receptionist. They can answer a call for you. But the very moment it turns into a real estate conversation, they cannot answer. They need to forward that to a licensee. Can an unlicensed assistant write a purchase contract for you? They cannot write a purchase contract derived from themselves. There's data entry that's allowed within a certain limited capacity, but they, and I hate to say it like this, but they cannot think for themselves. They cannot, create anything on their own whatsoever, any shape or form, because that takes a license to do that. Stay in your lane. A lot of real estate agents want to be the expert in everything, whether it's tax law, interior design, appraisals. If you're not licensed in that area, don't even comment on it. There's so many professionals and partners that we deal with on a regular basis. Partner up with someone who can provide that information, and all you have to say is, "That's a great question. Let me find out from one of my partners. I'll give you a call right back," or refer them to that partner that is a licensed professional in that area that they're asking. Because it is committing malpractice. You don't want to get into that. Write it down. I mentioned to you this before, but take notes. Follow up with an email documenting what that conversation is. In the course of a real estate transaction, your client is going to give you instruction. We have the duty of instruction. I would absolutely make sure that you document that. And it's simple. Just email them. And per our conversation, just wanted to summarize, you had instructed me to blank, whatever blank is. Or if it's a question that you're waiting for the responses on is, we spoke about this. Here are your options. Please let me know what your instructions are within X amount of days. So everything is documented. One of the things that I always, the thought process that I always have is if I have to go to court. So if I have to go to court, I'm preparing myself, and that any transaction I'm dealing with is if I have to go to court. Fortunately, I've never had in 21 years, but Nonetheless, I'm preparing for that by documenting everything throughout the transaction to ensure that I have all these things written down and I have communication from all parties and especially my client. Don't use templates. If you're using a template, how are you best protecting and representing your client? So if you're a buyer's agent and I randomly audited the last 20 files that you had, and all 20 of them have the exact same everything, same language, same days, same uh, clauses that are on there, did you really write the contract to protect your client's goals and priorities, or did you just grab a template and change some names around? Know the contract well enough where you don't even have to use a template. That's a matter of confidence and it's a matter of experience. Just learn it. It's not that difficult. If you need help, need coaching, call me. I'm happy to help you, whether you're in KW or not. If you're on the list side or buy side, I made some reference to it. Don't copy other MLS listings. It's garbage in, garbage out. So I've seen MLS listings that are just flat out, blatantly wrong for a variety of different reasons. It's the wrong HOA. It's the wrong HOA amount. Who knows? There's so many different reasons why it could be in error. And if you're just copying someone else's listing, you're copying that error. So look into it. We're required, and our license requires us to do research on everything. So just look at public record. There's data that you can pull and figure out on your own. It's not difficult. You've heard me say this before. I'll say it again. It's absolutely worth saying. Do a buyer consultation. Do a listing presentation. It is the most important thing that you can do with a client. When you do a buyer consultation as well, and you do a good one that lasts 45 minutes to an hour, you've educated them, you've shown your worth, you've shown that you're an expert. They're confident and excited to work with you. If anything goes sideways, you can do what we call a reconsult. You can pull them back in and say, "Hey, listen, let's re-strategize. Some of the strategies that we're using aren't working, or maybe they've picked a new area, so you want to sit down again." Having that initial buyer consultation is key, and they're more than happy to sit down with you and strategize. But if you don't have that initial consultation, they don't even know what to expect. And now when you try to sit down with them, they're going to like, am I in the principal's office? Why am I on detention? Why am I coming back in here to have a conversation with you? Same thing with the listing presentation. Go over what to expect, what the market is doing right now. Really pour into your clients and earn your worth. I think good real estate agents clients are more than happy to have and pay because they are true experts in what they do. Addendum versus amendment, when to use each. An amendment is to alter or change the contract, especially after it's executed. An addendum is typically something you're adding to the contract prior to full execution. Pretty simple, but if you're outside of KW, you can ask your broker what they prefer to use, but that's certainly the standard with us. We follow the spirit of the law and the definition of how it's used. Countering. So this one is a little funny because I see it all over. First of all, if you have a purchase contract and you're countering, you're not rejecting the purchase contract. You're accepting it, but with a counter. There's an area in Section T of the purchase contract that allows for that. You can counter, accept, or reject. You don't need to sign that box on the bottom. It's not a rejection. But if you're countering and that counter now, whatever that expiration date on the counter will supersede the expiration date that's on the purchase contract. But for clarity's sake, you could revive, so to speak, that date that's on the purchase contract. You never want to have confusion. Subject to contingencies. So make sure that, again, knowing your client's goals and priorities are super important. If they are purchasing a property, but it's subject to the sale of their previous or existing property, they need the proceeds to do that. Make sure that you state that in the purchase contract and make sure that you have the appropriate addenda if your firm allows for that. Certainly KW does, but make sure you have that in there because you're protecting your client's goals and priorities in their best interest by ensuring that they're protected. They don't have to move forward with this purchase if this doesn't happen or that doesn't happen or whatever it is. There's a variety of different reasons why you might have a contingency. It could be 1031, it could be subject to replacement property, contingent sale, so forth. Closing the windows. All that I mean by this is, when you look at the purchase contract, it heavily, heavily, heavily favors the buyer. So when you're writing a purchase contract up, you're going to write it obviously in favor of the buyer. If you're on the list side, I can't even imagine. I think maybe this is one time ever in my career that I've accepted an offer when I'm on the list side, accepted the offer as is without countering, because more than likely that offer is being written to the benefit of the buyer. So why wouldn't you want to counter? to make sure that you close some windows, so to speak, and closing some days or shortening the days on the contingencies for either side. And again, viewing the contract as a chessboard, you can now better and further negotiate and know where you can insert certain contingencies or remove certain things, or have a little bit more tolerance or flexibility on other things too. So really important stuff to know, guys. But that's it. That brings us to an end. Carrie, no questions, all right? Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys taking the time to jump in. This will live in perpetuity, so this will be on all the channels on Facebook and on YouTube. So if you want to refer to it later, please do. And thank you so much for taking the time. I'm here for everyone, whether you're with our firm or not. If you have questions about anything, whether it's coaching stuff on real estate, mindset stuff, whether it's contract stuff, which I love, I am here for all of you guys. Feel free to reach out to me, and I will talk to you soon. Good luck.